You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/kidsandfamily. Just go to Indeed.com/kidsandfamily right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.
If you like birds the way I do, I'll bet you really like hummingbirds. Now, how could you not? You know that saying, small but mighty? Well, these little guys really are giants in everything they do. In today's episode, Lanny Chambers joins me. He's been studying these mighty giants for well over 20 years. God, there's so many interesting things about these hummingbirds. We really could have talked for hours. This episode is really just kind of like a small appetizer into the wonderful world of hummingbirds. Do you know where they actually get their names? Now, I had no idea, but it totally makes sense. They get their name hummingbird, hit this one, from the humming sound of their wings. It's one of those, duh. Anyways, you probably know that most hummingbirds migrate south during the winter months. They head down south mainly to Mexico in search of a better food source, where there's flowers that are plentiful, and oh, by the way, they also eat insects. Now here's a few tidbits. Hummingbirds weigh less than a nickel. Now you heard me right, a nickel. The smallest hummingbird is called a bee hummingbird. Makes sense, right? It's about 2 inches long. Get this, there's actually a moth that looks a lot like a hummingbird. It's even got the name. They're called hummingbird hawk moths, and they're often really mistaken to be a bird. Now we get into this and talk about how you can really tell the difference between this moth and a bird. God, there's so much in this episode. Did you know that some shrimp boats actually put feeders on their boats out in the Gulf of Mexico because when the birds are migrating back, they can stop and feed from them? There's even some on oil platforms as well. Now, can you imagine you're out in the middle of the ocean and then you see this tiny giant buzzing around your feeder? I know it sounds silly, but I've been humming with excitement from all the new things Lanny brought to this episode. And I am absolutely positive you'll be humming too. This one is, get ready for it, a humdinger.
For real, 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 for real. Got a bunch of furry friends and I love them all the same. I'm an animal lover, veterinarian is the name. Let's share some pet stories from heartwarming to strange. Losses and games, from wacky to insane. For real. You're now tuned in to For Real with your host, Mark Kyle.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the For Real podcast. Today, my guest is Lanny Chambers, and we're going to have a really good time because we both have the passion for this specific topic today. We're going to talk hummingbirds. Lanny, thanks so much for being on the show. I can't wait to get into this. Ever since we talked, I've been looking into all kinds of things, and it's nice to have somebody on here that likes the same things that I do.
There's lots of us.
Yeah, well, there's a lot more than when you talk to people out there. There's a lot more people out there than you realize. I mean, God, by the way, why wouldn't you? So let's talk a little bit about you first, though. Let's get into your background, how you end up, being this guy that's just so passionate about these birds and studying them and offering all this information for people out there. So let's talk about you growing up and how you got the hummingbirds, and go through whatever you want to talk about, and then we'll get the hummingbirds and go from there.
Okay. Well, when I was a kid, we always had parakeets. My mom loved parakeets. So we had a string of them, and they suffered every imaginable dire end
I'm sure
parakeet can encounter, but that was part of the education too. At any rate, one of the first books I ever read was my mother's 1949 edition of The Golden Nature Guide for Birds, Eastern birds. But I've never been a real birder, that I don't keep a life list, and I don't travel 18 states away to see something rare. I might travel halfway across state to see a rare hummingbird, and we've seen hummingbirds on vacation, but that's not really the same thing. So I'm like birds, but a real birder wouldn't consider me one, and that's fine. It's a great hobby. It's just not one of mine.
Right, sure.
But anyway, I mean, I can name most of the birds that land in my yard, but that's about it. So anyhow, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, and I spent a lot of time at the National Zoo. And I guess my favorite exhibit was the birdhouse. And I'd read about oxpeckers and discovered that if I leaned over the railing and poked a finger through the wires, where they had vertical wires instead of glass in some of these cages, if I stuck a finger through, an oxpecker would immediately land on my finger and start grooming my fingernail for parasites.
That's pretty cool.
And I didn't even know what an oxpecker was, really, except for that. And then later on, the first time I took my wife out, the woman who's now my wife, this is like 55 years ago.
A couple days.
Yeah. we went in there, and there were some birds. I think they're called white-winged trumpeters. And I discovered that they like to have their heads scratched. And they'd recognize me when I remember that I was in there all the time. And they'd hop up in my lap and turn their necks to where they wanted their heads scratched. And that, it seems like, I did it for my own enjoyment, but it seems like that makes you very popular with the ladies.
Of course. Well, anybody that's an animal lover, if a woman doesn't like animals the way you do, then they're probably not the right woman anyways.
Exactly. And not to mention all the Japanese tourists with cameras that attracted them like a magnet, too.
I'll bet.
But anyway, and one time after I moved to St. Louis, they have an outdoor flight cage left over from the 19th World's Fair, and I got thrown out of it one time when a keeper walked in and found me with this enormous African vulture perched on my arm. But the same thing, turning its head to where it wanted me to scratch it.
Well, so from there, though, let's get to hummingbirds. How did you get from there to hummingbirds?
I guess it probably began in 1969. I spent the summer. My summer job was as a park ranger in Makepeace National Park. And one day during a monsoon shower, every day, I discovered that somebody put a hummingbird feeder out in the residential area of the park. And I stood next to it under an umbrella, and birds would come and feed, and I was just really fascinated by them. And then one of them flew under the umbrella and landed on a rib about a foot from my face and started preening. And I was kind of hooked at that point. I started paying more attention to hummingbirds.
Well, I loved them. I don't even remember the first time I saw one, because I think when I was a kid, I saw some. And I couldn't tell if it was a bird or an insect, because it was just so cool.
Well, the French word for him is oiseau-mouche. Oiseau-mouche, which is bird fly.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I read was there is a moth called a hummingbird's hawk moth or something like that, that looks like him.
Yes, indeed. Yep.
God. And I guess it looks, and I guess when I was reading it said if they've got like tentacles or something, that it's a moth versus a bird. Antennae,
well,
yeah.
They're pretty easy to tell apart if you look. I've seen all kinds of them. They're common, different species of hawk moths all over the place, and they hover at flowers pretty much like hummingbirds do, except they imagine a critter hovering over a flower, but it looks like it's bouncing on a rubber band.
Okay.
Kind of up and down,
up and down, yeah.
and up and down as its mouth parts go into various parts of the flower. Well, that's a moth. Hummingbirds don't do that. They hover steadily.
Yeah. Well, I'm not, it's funny. Now I have to watch because, I have a hummingbird feeder at my house because I love them too. And I actually made the mistake. One of the things I read on there, and I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but you really shouldn't put them by windows, apparently. I don't know why. What's the reason for that?
That's not true.
Oh, really?
No. Windows are great.
That's what I thought, because then I can watch, I love just.
You can watch them from inside.
Yeah, exactly.
You roll the blinds half closed and they can't see you if you don't turn a light on inside. So you can get your nose right up to the glass. All my feeders are in windows. The key is don't put them don't put them too far from the window. You want them to be close enough so if the bird gets startled and
then fly into the window,
it won't have enough room to get up enough speed to hurt itself if it hits the glass.
I gotcha. So let's get back. So you're now into hummingbirds. And let's kind of walk our steps through to get you to where you are today with the website and all that kind of stuff.
Okay. Well, I after seeing hummingbirds on backpacking trips to Colorado, up above tree line even, I joined a hummingbird mailing list in about late 90s, I guess. And one member of the mailing list was a licensed hummingbird bander. And she invited the rest of us to a party at her house.
Well, hold on one second. A hummingbird, what do they call it?
Bander.
Okay. Like a band of people?
No.
Okay.
Like she puts
bands on them. Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
Like bands.
Yeah, I got you.
Right. She at the time lived near Branson, Missouri. So probably 15 of us showed up, the ones who were within easy driving distance. And we had a good party. She had 14 feeders on her deck. I mean, like right next to each other. And all the perches were full, and there was several hundred more zooming around the trees. She had tons of hummingbirds. And she was banding them to show us what it was like, and so we could see them up close.
Okay, well, hold on one second real quickly. I'm sorry to interrupt, but so how did she get them to be able to put the bands on them?
Well, I'll get to that.
Okay, sorry. Sorry.
She had a trap.
Okay.
The trap has several large hoops. Hers hoops are made of they're embroidery hoops, I think. Think about 1.5 foot diameter hoop. And the cover there's one at the top and one at the bottom. And then there's one that moves up and down, and the top and the moving one are attached to some nylon mesh, tall fabric, I guess, like bridal veil or something.
Okay.
And she pulls a string and lifts the side up. Looks like a little circus tent. And you hang a feeder inside. When a bird goes into the feeder, you let go of the string and the sides fall and it traps it in the mesh.
Okay.
And the mesh is soft, so it can fly up against it and won't hurt itself. And it's got food in there. And then you reach in, and the hardest part of the whole operation, the part that really takes the most skill, is reaching in and grabbing the bird safely so you don't hurt it.
Right.
You have to learn how their wings bend and stuff like that, so you won't do anything wrong, injure the bird. So I was trapping birds for her at this party where she was banding them. I decided I liked to do that.
Well, that's not totally cool.
And I got pretty good at it. And at the end of the party, she said, you have a hand for that sort of thing. Would you like to learn to band hummingbirds? And that was an offer I couldn't refuse.
Of course.
So I went back a few weekends to her place, and she put us up for the weekend, and I banned some birds. And by the time I had about 100 of them, she said, "Okay, you're ready." And I got a permit
to ban hummingbirds.
From the USGS Bird Banding Laboratory. They're the ones who issue all bird banding permits in the country. And that was in like 1999, I guess. So I started banding hummingbirds in my home and at a couple of state parks in the Ozarks where I knew they had a lot of birds because I'd been to these parks several times. They had feeders up. And the key is going to a place that already has a sizable clientele at their feeders. And then you just you take down all the feeders but one and hang a trap around that one feeder, and you start catching birds. Anyhow, eventually I qualified for my own master banding permit, and it just changed my life.
Obviously.
my joy at watching hummers evolved into a citizen science project where I could make some useful contribution to our knowledge of these understudied birds.
Right. So,
and then when I was at the state parks were public events that attracted a lot of people who wanted to watch me work, and I'd let attendees, generally little kids, release each bird after it was banded, and that means they hold their hand flat, and I put the bird on it, and they get to feel its heartbeat for a few seconds.
Oh, that's so awesome.
And you can watch by their eyes that it changes their life too.
Sure.
It doesn't matter the age. The child can be 4 or 94, and there's a thrill to it.
Oh, absolutely.
This is something that they've never had the opportunity to do before and didn't really think about it until it happened to them. And the look on their faces is always the same, and it's just one of total amazement.
I would totally do that. So here's a quick question for you. So when you're banding them, I understand that you're banding them to be able to document the bird. What do they do once they're banded? Is it when they're damaged, or what do they do? Trap them again to see where they've migrated to, or what's all the purpose of that?
Okay. The purpose of banding any bird is to learn more about their life histories.
Sure.
Hummingbirds aren't studied well, and there's just a little over 100 licensed banders, period.
Wow.
In the world. Well, in Canada and the U.S., and now there's maybe a couple in South America. So the way you learn about species is to study individuals. And if you study enough individuals, you can start making generalizations.
Right.
And banding is how we know how long they live, by banding them and then recapturing them year after year until we don't catch them anymore, and then you assume that they aren't alive any longer.
So do you get to the point where you can tell the individual ones, like you have like your, obviously at your house, I'm sure you have multiple feeders. When they come back, if the ones that are migrating, do you recognize them again?
Not just by looking at them, but since my feeders are in windows, I can usually tell if they have a band or not.
Okay.
When they land on a feeder. And of course, if I trap them, if I see a bird with a band, I'll get the trap out and try and catch it immediately, because that's what we do it for, is to recapture them. That's when you learn something. It's when you catch them again. And of course, I have records of all the ones I've caught, but the big score is when you catch somebody else's bird.
Yeah.
Or somebody else is banded someplace else. With hummingbirds, doesn't happen very often because there's so few of us. It's like a net with a huge mesh, and most of them just slide through.
Right.
But I did catch a rufous hummingbird one time that had been banded in the previous winter in Louisiana by a woman I know down there. Who's a quite famous bander named Nancy Newfield. She'd banded this bird, and it had gone back after she banded it, presumably to the West Coast to breed, and then it was on its way back to the Gulf Coast to spend the winter, presumably, and it stopped by my feeder, and I caught it. And I've caught a couple of other out-of-range rufous hummingbirds at other people's houses. And a couple of my birds have been captured too. One immature male I banded here and was caught, I think about 3 weeks later in East Texas.
That's
It
cool.
was migrating. Yeah, that is cool. But as for tracking a bird back and forth, we hope that in the next couple of years we'll have radio devices small enough to put on hummingbirds, and we'll be able to do that real time. But right now, it's just luck of the draw.
Well, the other thing is too, there's
bird, we learn.
Right, but the other problem I would see, there's only 100 banders, so that if catching them a different one is probably not that easy either. Obviously,
No, it's not. It's not. I've caught birds. I've caught dozens of birds, recaptured them when they came back the next year. And as a matter of fact, the first birds to arrive in the spring are often wearing bands. The first few of them, they know where the good juice is, and they beeline for it.
Huh.
We think they remember pretty much every feeder on a migration route, and that's supported by the fact that all banders recapture their own birds where they originally trapped them, and sometimes predictably year after year. So they have fairly phenomenal memories in that little head.
Now, back to the rufous one. Is that the one that migrates the farthest? It seems to me, if I remember correctly, that like really goes from almost Alaska all the way down to Tierra del Fuego or something.
No.
Okay.
No, they tend. Most rufous winter in southwestern Mexico in the mountains.
Okay.
But some winter, a few, not many, small, probably fraction of a percent, winter elsewhere, chiefly along the Gulf Coast, and occasionally, there have been two rufous that have overwintered in Missouri so far, successfully.
Wow.
And one of them came back the next winter. So these birds aren't lost. The fact that we recapture them in unusual places again in successive years means they know where they are. They just have a different plan than most of them.
Well, they just have their favorite restaurants.
It could be.
Yeah.
Well, we think that migration, at least in hummingbirds, if not all birds, is pretty much genetic. That they have an instinct that they inherited that tells them to fly in a certain direction for a certain amount of time, and then look for a place where they like to spend the winter. And then they fly back in the spring, because in the spring, these winter places are full of local species of hummingbirds that don't migrate, and nesting sites are at a premium. And our hummingbirds aren't very big, and they get beat up a lot. So they fly back up north to where they hatched.
Right.
To breed again. But there's a reliable number of rufous hummingbirds and a few other species, but mostly rufous, that winter in the southeastern U.S. Instead of Mexico. And to me, that's a boon to the species, because if something happens to their habitat, we've got a subpopulation with a different plan that won't be affected.
Well, how many species are there in North America and the U.S.?
Most people say 16.
16.
There's 16 species that have built nests in the U.S. 15 of them have been observed to breed. One of them built a nest, but nobody saw any eggs.
Right.
And some of them are pretty restricted in their range, and others are quite widespread in their ranges.
Well, what I liked on your website, and I went into a variety of different ones, I think almost all of them, being in Texas, almost all of them would come, they're in Texas, which was pretty cool.
Well, yeah, at least occasionally.
Yeah, that's
banded birds in Texas, and banded some that were unusual for where I was banding, but still, you play the cards you're dealt, right?
Exactly. And for the listeners, let's talk about migration, because I know that there's a couple that actually stay in the colder areas that I read, but the majority of them, because I know, because I love hummingbirds, and I know they go and they come back in the spring and that. Can you talk a little bit about the migration and how that works here in the States for, they're here during the warmer weather, I guess, when all the flowers are here and stuff like that?
Okay. I'm gonna paraphrase something on my website here.
Okay.
Because I wrote it down and it's a pretty good explanation.
Good.
Anyway, hummingbirds are tropical birds. Well, originally were tropical birds that evolved to their present forms, like just about all migratory birds, during the last ice age. And when the ice sheets retreated from North America, the birds that were in the tropics gradually just expanded their ranges to exploit new food resources that they didn't have to fight over. It was just the places where glaciers used to be became quite rich, and in probably a few hundred years, and didn't have a lot of birds in them, so it was like a free meal. Anyway, when the weather gets too cold, they start running out of stuff to eat. I mean, hummingbirds' diet is insects and flowers. Well, arthropods, insects and spiders and their eggs and larvae, and flower nectar. And in the winter, the flowers aren't blooming in most places, and the bugs aren't flying around either. They're all kind of spending the winter however they spend it. Depends on the species of bugs, whether they die off and rehatch in the spring or whatever. Some of them actually kind of hibernate.
So they're following the food.
Yeah, there's no food, so they have to go south to find food again. And it just becomes a cycle. And it's the same for all birds that migrate.
Well, one thing I read back on, just a small little tidbit that I read too, was the hummingbird is the smallest migrating bird in the world.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
And as a matter of fact, the bee hummingbird in Cuba is the smallest bird in the world, period.
Oh, I didn't know that. I knew that was the smallest hummingbird. Tiny.
It's about 2/3 the size of a ruby-throated.
Wow.
It's really small.
Well, what is surprising to me when I was reading that, so we've got the 16 or 17 or whatever the amount is here in North America. The majority of them are in South America, but there's like a total of, and the numbers vary. Everything I read, like 330 different types or something like that.
Yeah, you see numbers from 320 to 360.
Right.
It's lumpers versus splitters. There are arguments among biologists as to whether some birds are the same or different species. They're closely related, but these are angels dancing on the head of a pin to me. The hummingbirds that we're likely to see here none of them fall into that category. They're all pretty easily identified.
Right.
But yes, there's over 300 species, and half of them live only in Ecuador. I
saw that. It's crazy. Well, it's funny about Ecuador. It's the most biodiverse country in the world because of the Galapagos. But now I think, well, maybe it's also because of the hummingbirds, because there's so many of them.
Well, it's the mountains.
Yeah.
And it gets cold. They don't have much winter on Ecuador. I mean, the name means equator.
Right.
But there's some change, I guess. And critters down there, whether they're birds or mammals or reptiles or anything, choose an elevation in the mountains that suits their lifestyle and their food needs. And to some extent, hummingbirds do that in, say, California. In the winter, they tend to move down slope where it's warmer. And in the summer, they move upslope where there's more, where it gets warm in the spring, and then there's more to eat, less competition.
I was going to ask you too, when they go, because I saw some can get up as high as 17,000 feet. Are they higher up there? Is there less predators for them in the higher altitudes, or is this because there's more food and is more available?
I don't know. I think it's just an unoccupied niche.
Right.
They found a place with no competition, and they took advantage of it. And organisms do that. Organisms of all type do that. They tend to expand, to breed and expand to fill the carrying capacity of their niche. And then some of them, if they outgrow that, some of them may, through just normal genetic variation, have slightly different needs, and they'll wander off and find a niche that suits them better and maybe be pioneers or something. It's all logical in its own way, and it all has to do with habitat and evolution.
Well, I've got a question about illogical. So you were saying that there's roughly 100 banders that are registered or licensed or whatever you call it, permitted, and there's only 2 in South America. If all the hummingbirds are down there, why aren't there more banders down there?
Well, first of all, it's difficult to band in South America and Central America, and the governments don't have money to put into it.
Okay.
And the universities have better things to do with their students, and it's a matter of priorities.
Right.
We're lucky. We live in a rich country where people can afford to specialize in fields that are of limited ability to make a living.
Right. That makes sense.
Which means in a poor country, you can't make a living as an ornithologist at all, probably. A few people can, but they do have universities. But there's, if a poor Mexican family has some sugar, they're not going to waste it on hummingbirds.
Right. Well, that makes sense. A lot of sense.
Yeah. It's a matter of resource preservation and conservation. And we can, so we do.
Right.
And they would have difficulty, so they don't. Now some banders in the U.S. have made trips to Central America to try and train banders to catch some of our birds that we know migrate there, because we see them, but there's nobody to catch them.
Right.
Like in Costa Rica, for instance, or Nicaragua. And there are other reasons too that it's in Latin America. There's places where you don't want to go wandering around the countryside.
Yeah, like the drug areas.
It's dangerous.
Yeah.
And it's not worth the risk.
Yeah, you're not allowed in the coca field to find a hummingbird.
I hate to say that, but it's just true. There's places that are too dangerous to go. They don't care that you're just trying to ban hummingbirds. They don't understand that. They just assume you're working for some other cartel who's a rival, or I don't know. It's crazy.
Well, this is going to be me and my silly humor. They just want you humming in their in their cocoa fields with their product. They just rather you look at the bird somewhere else.
For real, for real, for real, for real, for real, for real, for real.
And we'll be right back. We are supported by PrepVet, providing stem cell therapy for pets.
As a pet lover, did you know your pet can benefit from the incredible healing power of stem cell therapy? Prep Therapy offers a groundbreaking solution taken right from your pet's own blood. Say goodbye to joint pain, arthritis, kidney and liver conditions, and more. They'll experience faster recovery, increased vitality, and extended quality of life without the need for surgery or harmful drugs. Put the wag back in their tail and discover Prep Therapy today at PrepVet.com. Save 10% with promo code FurRealPodcast, covered by most pet insurance.
You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/kidsandfamily. Just go to Indeed.com/kidsandfamily right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.
Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience and their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's LIBSYN, ads.com today.
What's funny is that, again, as an admitted person who's loved hummingbirds as long as I can remember, I didn't realize where the name came from, and it's so logical. You go, aha! Can you tell everybody where the name comes from? And it's an aha moment.
Yeah, well, it's their wing sound.
Yeah.
Hummingbirds, especially males, have a little space between the last and the next to the last wing feather, the longest outermost wing feather, the primaries. And in some of them, it actually generates a whistle. And in all of them, it produces a humming sound. The sound is different for each species. And I've spent time out west. One time we stayed in a B&B that had a feeder, and there were about 8 species coming to this feeder. It's in Arizona. And I got so I could identify them and then tell males from females just by the wing sound without seeing them. But I have a musical ear, and it took some training, but it's something that it's real. You can tell.
Right. Well,
some of them actually whistle. They have they sound like if you've been to Colorado out in the country and you hear what sounds like a police whistle blowing.
Mm-hmm.
That's a male broad-tailed hummingbird.
Wow, so cool.
It's a warning to stay out of their territory. And they can turn it on and off by moving those feathers around consciously. And when one wants to go poach in another bird's territory, he turns off his wing whistle, so he's more likely to be able to sneak in undetected without getting caught.
So he twists his feather around so it's not making the sound. That's cool.
Correct.
That's wild.
Yeah, they're devious little buggers.
Well, the other thing is too, when and I've seen it, but again, I always say, and all this stuff you know, but you don't know unless you pay attention, is how everybody says, well, they're always so mean, but they're territorial, and they're really protecting that. Can you talk a little bit about that too, so people understand, and actually, so I know more about it too?
Sure, and they behave at flowers exactly the same way they do at feeders. I've watched hummingbirds defend an isolated patch of wildflowers ruthlessly to where it must have been exhausting. They were just flying all the time, chasing, barely get a chance to rest and feed. And of course, the more they chase, the more they have to eat. Now, the nectar that they defend isn't very nutritious. It's calories to burn for the high performance flight they use to catch bugs. They'll hawk bugs on the wing. Sometimes you may have seen a hummingbird perched in your yard, and it'll fly up a few feet and then fly back to the perch. Chances are it's just grabbed a gnat that you probably couldn't see.
Oh,
so
really?
They do that all day, and they'll eat hundreds of bugs a day. And their flight is very energy intensive, and so they have to drink a lot of nectar just for the calories to burn to sustain their flying ability.
Well, one of the things that I read, which I thought was amazing, is the oxygen consumption per gram muscle. I wrote this down. I'm reading it.
It's astonishing.
It's 10 times higher than an elite professional athlete.
Right, and their hearts are built to handle that. They don't look like ours at all. They're more tubular, and they when they're hovering, their heart beats about 1,200 beats a minute.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And so
plus,
like all birds, they have air sacs connected to their lungs that are kind of spaced out into their muscles that act like sort of secondary lungs that can provide oxygen to muscles more or less directly. And most birds are built like that. It's how they manage to expend enough energy to fly without getting overheated and such. But the amount of oxygen they consume is just epic.
Well, and then when they're drinking the liquids, mainly is what their big deal is nectar. It's twice their body weight or something like that. It's crazy.
At least their body weight, maybe twice. It kind of depends on what they're doing, and this probably varies by species somewhat.
Yeah. Well, there's one thing I want to get into, but before I do that, since we're talking numbers here, can you talk about how fast their wings flap? I mean, it's astounding to me how fast per second.
Yeah. Okay. Well, a common small hummingbird like a ruby throat or a rufous or a black-chinned, small birds like that, beat around generally 55 or 60 times a second.
A second.
The little
second.
hummingbirds like, yes.
I know. It's crazy.
Wait a minute, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I've got it written down on the notes because they say it's per second.
Yeah. But the smallest hummingbirds, like the bee, may go up to 80 or 90 beats per second. And big hummingbirds, like the giant hummingbird, which is it's a real giant, it's about the size of a goldfinch or a chickadee, a little bigger than a chickadee. Their wing beat is only about 15 or 20 times per second.
Because it's bigger?
And I've never seen a live one in person, but I've seen film of them, and they don't hum, they kind of go.
They flutter.
It really sounds quite different.
And they normally live about 4 to 5 years. I know the record's 12 years, but on average it's about 4 to 5 years. Is that what it is?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Well, our common ones do. That may vary. I'm pretty sure that not all of them have been well documented because some of them are pretty rare and not been banded very much, so we don't know very much about them. And there are birds that have been studied in laboratories, but that doesn't count as far as generalizing to wild populations. Lab animals of just about any species generally live about twice as long as their wild cousins
Right.
do, because they're not exposed to predation and disease and starvation and that sort of thing.
I was surprised about who their real predators are. Can you there's one in particular, but can you kind of go through who the predators are other than, I know cats are, but what are their biggest predators?
Well, cats are invasive aliens. They aren't native to the
Right.
predators. They're natural predators, but cats will kill anything they can catch.
Right.
If they're cats.
Right.
What they do. I guess in the wild, their most common predators are other birds. And I know what you're thinking of, and we'll get to that.
Read my mind?
Yes.
Of course.
But small hawks, like Cooper's hawks, or other little hawks that have sharp, pointy wings, are adapted for hunting birds, and they can fly through trees, chase other birds through the branches of trees without getting hung up and such. And so when one of them shows up, all the birds go hide. We get them in our yard too, Cooper's hawks, all the time, and they'll eat anything they can catch. But they'll go for hummingbirds, but they'd have to be pretty hungry because hummingbirds are hard to catch.
They're fast.
Well, they're not. It's not that they're fast. They fly about 25 miles an hour, but they're quick.
Right.
And they can
fly backwards,
back and forth fast enough to evade being caught if they can see the predator coming. Now, what you were thinking of is praying mantises.
Exactly. You got it 100%. That's exactly it. How does that work?
Again, those are invasive aliens too. The big mantises that are dangerous to hummingbirds are Chinese mantises. And they come from, guess where? China. And people started bringing their egg. I don't know if you remember when you were a kid, you could order egg cases for your garden to keep, because they eat aphids and things.
Right.
To keep the pests in your gardens down. They used to be popular. You could buy egg cases at garden shops and get them to the mail. And anyway, but the Chinese mantis is big. And there are videos of them on YouTube catching hummingbirds. And what they typically do is they hang upside down under a feeder.
A feeder.
Wait, under a feeder.
Ah.
And they wait for a bird to land, and they can just snatch it from underneath. And their arms are long, their forelimbs are long and have claws, and they'll grab them and they rip their throats out. Drink their blood.
Well, I was going to say, what do they eat? So they're just drinking the blood. That's gross.
I don't know if that's all they eat or not. They're capable of eating quite a bit. I don't know if anybody studied that, but if you see, here's the clue. If you see a big mantis on your feeder, don't kill it, because they are beneficial in their own way. Just move it away from the feeder.
Right.
They don't fly well, and it's unlikely to come back soon.
I was thinking they probably hid underneath the flowers, but actually the feeder makes more sense.
They see birds coming to a feeder, and they're only bugs, but they're not totally stupid. They recognize a good thing when they see it, and they'll fly to the feeder. And they're clumsy flyers, but they can fly. And they'll land on the feeder and then crawl underneath and just wait.
You know, that brings up something that I was listening to a podcast yesterday about somebody I was thinking about having on about what a sentient being is. And there's studies right now on insects, whether or not they're sentient beings. And when you're saying they're thinking and knowing that, does that make them a sentient being? I don't want to get into that discussion, but it makes sense.
It's largely a matter of definition, and I don't have a position on that.
Yeah.
I made up my mind. And the arguments tend to be over definition and how many boxes it checks. And, you know, is sentient the same as self-aware?
Right.
Maybe not.
Well,
I can't say that a praying mantis is self-aware, but their instincts do let them recognize a good food source, and they're adaptive enough to learn how to use it.
Well, again, this is off subject, but this guy was talking about sharks, and there's a paper out there saying that they're not sentient beings because they don't feel pain the way typical does. Of course, the guy that was on the podcast absolutely believes they are, but there's a paper out there whether or not sharks are sentient beings. Again,
I don't know anything about that. I don't know what that has to do with sentience.
Yeah, I know. It's again, you say potato, I say potato, kind of a thing.
It could be.
Yeah. So let's talk about. I know you talked about the smallest one being 2 inches. I know you said there. How big is the finch or whatever one you were comparing to? So it goes from 2 inches to how big can a hummingbird get? The biggest ones?
Well, I've seen them compared to goldfinches.
And how big?
Well, I don't know, sparrow size.
Okay.
But not as fat. They're thinner than that. They don't weigh as much. And not including their beak as part of their size. It's the body size. I had an interesting experience once. A bunch of hummingbird banders had a party near New Orleans at the house of one of the banders. I got to meet a lot of people that I'd only known online before.
So the banders banded together. Anyway, sorry, it's just me.
But we didn't band each other.
Okay.
The bands are way too small. By the way, hummingbird band is about half the size of a BB shot.
Wow.
Yeah, they're really small. Anyway, one of the attendees was a fellow named Van Remsen, and he's a noted ornithologist. And I don't know if he's probably retired by now, but at the time, this is in 2000, I guess, he was the director of the Louisiana State University Museum of Natural Science. And he invited me to come over on I think it was a Sunday. It was a day the museum was closed, to show me the bird collection. And bird collections are cabinets with large, shallow drawers, and the drawers are full of birds, dead stuffed birds.
Right.
They're called study skins, and they'll take a dead bird and they'll remove all its innards and fill it full of cotton. And it's a way to study the plumage and make lots of measurements and figure out how to tell them apart and so forth. And Van directed studies. I mean, he sent grad students. He's a professor at LSU. He would send grad students all over the world to collect birds for his collection. And he was showing me the collection, and he said, "Okay, close your eyes and hold out your hands." And I did. And he put a bee hummingbird in one hand and a giant hummingbird in the other hand. He said, "Okay, open up." And it was absolutely jaw-dropping experience to have the smallest and biggest hummingbirds.
Wow, that is cool.
Well, they're carcasses in your hands.
Right.
The difference in size, and it was quite dramatic.
Well, I'm going to go to weight because one of the things I read is that even the largest hummingbird weighs less than a nickel.
That's not quite true.
Okay, good.
Well, wait a minute. I'm not sure about a nickel. Okay, a small hummingbird weighs about the same as a penny.
Okay, a penny. Think about that. It's crazy.
About 3 grams.
Yeah. The other thing is their nest. Can you talk how big their nest is? This tiny little thing too. How big is their nest?
Well, it depends on the size of the bird, again, the species.
Right.
Let's use ruby throats as an example again. Ruby throats or rufous, because most people have them, one or the other. Their nests are about the size of a golf ball.
It's unbelievable.
Yep.
And the eggs are the size of a jelly bean or a coffee bean.
No, smaller than that.
Smaller than that.
Tic Tac.
Wow. That's so cool.
They couldn't carry an egg larger than that.
Yeah, here's a question I have for you, and we can get in about how long it takes for eggs to hatch and all that. But what's the gestation period before they actually hatch an egg? How long does that normally take? I didn't see that anywhere.
Usually about 2 weeks.
Okay, so it takes about 2 weeks. The egg comes out, and let's walk through that process. Can you kind of go through that process a little bit?
Sure. I know most about ruby throats, so I'll talk about that.
That's fine.
Even at Tic Tac size, a female ruby-throated hummingbird can only carry 1 egg at a time. There's just not room.
Okay.
So she'll build a nest, mate, probably the next day lay 1 egg, and then the next day after that a day or 2 later will lay a second egg. And they're always 2 eggs.
Right.
Just always. If you see a nest with 3, it's because another bird laid an egg in there. You see a nest with 1, it's because something got one of the eggs or it fell out or something.
Right.
It's safe to assume they always lay 2 eggs. And they hatch roughly 2 weeks later, and it may depend a bit on the temperature. But in cooler locations, the chicks may take a little longer to develop, another day or 2.
How small are the babies?
Honeybee size.
Wow, I'd love to see a little baby one.
Yeah, well, and within another 3 weeks, they leave the nest.
I know. I read that.
And when they leave the nest, they're the size of adults.
They're the size of adults? They grow that fast?
Yes.
Wow.
It's astonishing. The mother spends all her time fetching mostly bugs for them. They need the protein to grow feathers and bones. And some nectar, she'll feed a slurry of, cough it up from her crop and inject it directly into their crops.
Yeah, regurgitated. That's what I read.
Yeah, well, hummingbirds are one of the few kinds of birds that retain their crop into adulthood. And the crop is sort of like a dead-end sac off the esophagus.
Okay.
Which goes directly to the stomach.
So it's kind of like a, for lack of a better word, like an Adam's apple kind of thing?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. It's like a pocket.
Okay.
Inside. A branch of the esophagus goes into this
storage chamber
bag inside their throat, and they can control whether something goes into the crop or directly into the stomach. And the main reason that chicks have these, the chicks of all, I guess probably all birds have a crop. I don't know that for a fact, but it's probably true. Is that they get fed, and then the whatever they get fed trickles from the crop down into their stomach steadily, so they have a steady supply of food to develop. And that's how they can eat so much, even when their mother's away, getting more food.
Right.
But hummingbirds keep the crop into adults because they have a similar problem at night, that they need a certain number of calories to keep their body temperature up at night when it's cooler, especially in cooler locations. So their last feed of the day, they'll fill their crop. You may have noticed that as it's getting dark, the hummers will come to your feeder and they'll spend more time and more visits, and they'll sit there and guzzle before they disappear for the night. And the reason is they're filling their crop. It's like a reserve fuel tank for them.
Right.
And it keeps calories hitting their stomach for processing even while they're asleep, so they can keep their body temperature up. And the body temperature is about 104 degrees Fahrenheit.
So they're a little bit warm rest. So tell me about that. This reminds me, I really wanted to ask you, so it reminded me of something. The torpor, where that hibernation kind of thing that they do, are they flying when they're doing that, or are they just sitting somewhere?
No, it's like a hibernation. They aren't going anywhere. They're perched. Their eyes are closed. Usually their beaks pointing straight up in the air, just like they were asleep. And they're going to torpor most nights. Even with the crop, it's hard to make it through the entire night without running out of food. So torpor reduces their metabolism, and their heart slows way down, their breathing slows way down, and they're not expending energy except just to keep their internal functions
right, like a meditative state.
Oh, far deeper than that.
Wow.
It's more like under anesthesia.
Wow.
You are conked out, and at night, most hummingbirds will go into a torpor at night. Maybe not all of them every night. Kind of may depend on conditions. And we think that the daylight will wake them up.
Huh.
First light that'll trigger something internally, bring them out of torpor. It may take a half an hour before they can function, before they're able to fly.
Another thing that and again, the way I read it, and this is why I'm asking, is it seems to me that they're almost solitary. It's like they mate, but it doesn't seem, based on what I read, and again, I may have this incorrect, obviously, but that once they mate, that the mate goes off and does their thing, and they do their thing, and they kind of hang out on their own. They don't really have like a bunch of friends.
Correct.
Wow.
I would say no friends.
Wow.
And the male's only function in the whole mating process is fertilizing the female. And then once that's done, he's off looking for the next lady to impress. And she goes about her life, and all hummingbirds or females are single moms. Males play zero part in
raising. I know, it's crazy. And the females are bigger than the males too, generally.
Yeah, most species, yes.
Yeah.
Not all. Slightly bigger. Not a lot, but a little bit. I'd say, judging by weight, the average adult male ruby-throated is about 2.7 grams, 2.8 in, say, breeding weight. And the average female will be about 3.2.
Okay.
By the way, I found giant hummingbirds weigh about 20 grams.
Okay. So I don't know what a nickel weighs.
I guess you could look that up.
Yeah.
It's as easy as me. And it says that they're 8 inches long, but I think that must include the bill.
Okay. And then the other thing I got so many things we could talk for days. And they can fly 500 miles without stopping, which is phenomenal to me.
It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah. But little tiny thing.
Yeah, but there's a secret to that. And banders know it because we see it. In late summer, when the birds are getting ready to migrate, a 2.7 gram male ruby-throated can approach 6 grams when I catch them.
So they're almost twice their size.
They double their weight, and it's all fat. And when you have them in your hand, you can feel it. They feel like a little blob of chicken fat.
That's amazing.
I mean, you can see it on your feeder. You pay attention. The first place it shows up on a feeder bird is around their neck. And you'll see that when they turn their head to look off to the side, the neck will bulge on that side.
That's crazy.
From the fat that's built up. And another place that's a little more difficult to see, but typical, is between their their vent, their cloaca hole, and their tail, between their legs, there's a small section of tiny white downy feathers. And if you look at a picture of a bird that shows that part of the body, you'll see that hummingbirds have these white feathers, at least ruby throats have these white feathers. And that's another locus of fat accumulation. And they'll get so much fat that it'll bulge the tissue out and make the feathers stand up on end.
Like a headdress.
Well, upside down.
Yeah.
And Vanders call it the lace panties effect.
Oh, that's a great name, the lace panties effect. I love that.
You can see this on your feeder too. If you have a kind of feeder that'll let you see a bird's underneath a bird's tail, you may see that. And another place is behind their shoulders, up between their shoulders. They don't really have shoulders, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, sure.
In the middle of their back, high on their back, there will be a hump develops of fat.
Show that.
Like I say, they'll double their weight from 3
Wow.
grams to 6 grams. And I've seen females go 6.2, 6.4 grams. And I see a bird like that, I know it's not going to be around the next morning. It's going to be gone. But this is because in migration, they're never quite sure where their next meal's coming from.
Well, for 500 miles.
And then when the 500 miles is usually quoted for going from Yucatan to our Gulf Coast, which is about 500 miles. And the birds will arrive on the coast in northern Yucatan, and they'll spend several days there, and they'll double their weight.
Again.
They'll chow down, and when they're fat enough, they leave. They won't fool around because you don't want to waste your reserve fuel supply.
Right.
And we figure that a ruby-throated at 6 grams will be able to fly about 600 miles. So they've
incredible.
got plenty of range, but that doesn't mean they won't take advantage of an opportunity. Some shrimpers in the Gulf, shrimp boats, will carry hummingbird feeders.
Oh, that's cool.
On the boat, and if a bird spots a boat, it'll come check it out, and it finds a feeder. It may spend the rest of the day there.
That's cool.
Putting on some more weight.
I love that. That's really cool.
That's pretty neat. Also, Texas towers, oil platforms.
Oh, yeah.
And they aren't generally that far offshore, but you know, an opportunity is an opportunity, and if the bird finds an oil platform one spring on the way back, it'll know where to look for it the next year, and it'll probably keep using it the rest of its life.
You know, another thing I read too that I thought was pretty fascinating is their legs and their feet aren't for walking; they're just for hopping and being able to perch, and that's it. They don't walk on their feet.
That's part of their
aerodynamics.
Well, part of their flight regimen.
Right.
Okay, hummingbirds. If you've seen, one of the many documentaries on hummingbirds, they'll all talk about hummingbirds co-evolving with flowers that gradually became tubular as the hummingbird's bills got correspondingly longer to get into the long tubes.
Huh.
And the reason was, matter of fact, I saw an excellent one a couple of days ago. It was the David Attenborough one that was on, I think it was on Nature or PBS a couple of years ago. Most flowers, flowers evolved being pollinated primarily by insects.
Right.
Or a lot of them, the ones that aren't pollinated by the wind and a few other animals. And insects would come in and for a free meal, they get coated with pollen and they go to the next flower and transfer the pollen. And that's how flowers keep their gene pool stirred up. And some of them, though, as birds evolved, started specializing in hummingbirds. And hummingbirds were attracted to these flowers because it's a reliable source of food that they don't have to compete for except with other hummingbirds. And the reason is that the typical hummingbird favored flower has no place to perch. the only way to feed from it is to hover.
Oh.
Hovering is extremely energy intensive. It's very expensive. And a hummingbird will perch if it can find a place to perch, but they don't rely on it. And other birds, of course, generally can't hover with enough accuracy to feed on a flower or for long enough to make it worth doing. So they have other plans to get food.
What?
But the hummingbirds hover, and they feed on flowers that insects generally can't get into.
Well, and they're also the only bird. They're the only bird that can fly backwards, so they can go back and forth and do that.
And upside down.
Oh, and upside down. That's right. I read that too. So, and the other thing that is crazy is that aeronautical engineers have studied how they fly to help develop different kinds of planes in flight. Like that's which I think is fascinating too.
There's a robot hummingbird.
There is.
Somebody did.
Like a drone kind of a thing?
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's a lot bigger than a hummingbird. It has to carry a battery, for instance.
Right.
But it hovers using the same wing motion that hummingbirds do, which hummingbirds are the only birds that get lift on both forward and backward wing sweeps.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about that. I'm a pilot.
Birds get lift when they flap down, and then they fold their wings to minimize wind resistance for the upstroke. But hummingbirds don't really flap up and down; they flap front and back. Well, I guess they do flap when they're traveling in a straight line. It's up and down, but they get lift both directions. They get more lift on the downstroke, but they get significant lift on the upstroke too.
That's crazy.
And that's what enables them to hover in place without wobbling all over the place.
That's crazy. So before we get done, can you talk for everybody that's listening? Because I know people make the mistake. Talk about feeders and the red dye, what they shouldn't be putting in there. I've read about it, and I actually have always made my own nectar, I guess, would you ever sugar water.
Okay.
And the best percentage and all that stuff, and the ones not to use for sure that's bad for them.
I got a whole page on my website devoted to this.
Yeah, and we're going to get to your website here in a second.
I'm religiously fervent about this. The only thing to put in a hummingbird feeder is a mixture of 1 part plain granulated white sugar to 4 parts plain water. You don't need to boil the water. You don't need to. If you can drink it out of the tap, that's good enough for a hummingbird.
Okay. I've always boiled mine. I didn't know you didn't have to boil it.
Pardon?
I've always boiled mine, so I didn't know you didn't have to boil it.
You can boiling it. If you put the sugar in while it's still hot, the sugar dissolves more easily, but that's trivial. That's
so 1 to 4. I've always done 1 to 3. So you're saying 1 to 4 is better.
Sometimes I'll go 1 to 3 in cold weather if I still got a feeder out.
Okay.
So the bird can get a little more nourishment for its effort. But in the summer, 1 to 4 is better at keeping them from getting dehydrated. They need the water.
Right. So basically, for everybody,
all that oxygen processing,
sure,
and produces a lot of heat, and they need water for that to cope with it. They get dehydrated just like anything else.
So the simplify for guys listening. So if you have 2 cups of water, you're going to have a half a cup of sugar.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. 1 part sugar, and this is by volume.
Right.
1 part sugar, 1 part water. Do not use powdered sugar because it has cornstarch in it. We don't want that.
Honey's not good. A bunch of things aren't good.
Because honey, when you put honey in water, you end up with botulism.
Oh, really?
Yeah, most honey has botulin spores in it. But the spores won't grow in honey, straight honey. It's safe. And anyway, humans develop a tolerance for botulin toxin as they grow. You may have heard advice, don't ever give honey to a baby who's less than a year old. And the reason is that they don't have the resistance built up yet.
So
you can poison a baby with honey. So don't use honey for babies, and don't use honey for hummingbirds, because when you mix it with water, then the spores can reproduce, and it's a mold of sorts, and it can produce a poison that will kill a bird.
So here's another question that I've had because that where I have two questions actually. So probably 20 questions, but the first question is if I don't have a lot of hummingbirds there, how often should you change the water?
Okay, let me finish on the sugar.
Okay, cool.
First.
Okay.
I was thinking about that. Absolutely do not use brown sugar. The brown in sugar is iron, just like rust.
Right.
That's what causes the brown color. And it's a small amount. It has no consequence to humans. But hummingbirds, since hummingbirds' normal diet, nectar and bugs, doesn't offer them much in the way of minerals, their bodies have no feedback mechanism to regulate their intake. Like if we have too much iron, we just we excrete the excess, so it can't hurt us. Hummingbird can't do that. It accumulates. And if you give them brown sugar, they can easily accumulate enough iron to cause a fatal condition called hemochromatosis.
My father had hemochromatosis. I know exactly what it is.
Okay, well, it's an iron. It's too much iron.
It goes to all your major organs. I know all about it.
Yes, it does. And okay, well, it'll happen to birds. And your father apparently had a problem with his regulatory mechanism.
His body didn't filter out iron.
Right. And birds don't, hummingbirds at least, don't either at all. None of them. So do not use any sort of brown sugar, and that includes what health food stores call raw sugar or natural sugar.
Right.
If it's brown, don't use it. Just taste test. They like cane sugar better than beet sugar, so spend a little extra and buy cane sugar.
Cane sugar, okay.
C&H is just perfect.
Okay, so back to the other question. Okay. How often should I change the water?
All right. I like to tell people, don't worry about a given number of days, but look at the syrup, and if it starts turning cloudy, it's time to change it.
Okay.
Because the cloudiness is bacteria growing in the sugar solution. Remember, this is a culture.
Right.
It's like a petri dish you're going for here.
Sure.
And you can boil the water all you want, and that'll kill any bacteria in the water, but it won't do anything for the bacteria that gets a free ride in on the bills of other birds that feed at the feeder. Hummingbirds, half a hummingbird's diet is bugs, and bugs are all over they get into everything, and bugs are covered with bacteria.
Right.
So the birds get that when they eat the bugs, and they'll transfer it to basically inoculate a bird feeder when they use it. And the more birds are visiting your feeder, the faster it'll start turning cloudy. And that could be within 2 days, or it could be within 2 weeks, depending on your feeder traffic, and also the ambient temperature.
I was going to say,
weather will make a difference too. If you don't have a lot of birds, you can easily go a week, but rely on just looking at it. If it's clear, and that I'm not talking about colorless, because sugar will often have a little bit of a yellow tinge to it.
Yeah.
But sugar water. But if it starts getting cloudy, don't wait till you can't see through it anymore. When it starts getting milky looking, clean the feeder, dump it out, clean the feeder, rinse it under hot running water in the sink with a brush. That's good. You don't need to use soap. And then refill it with fresh.
Yeah.
And you can keep excess syrup in the refrigerator for probably a couple weeks without a problem, in a covered container, bottle or something.
Okay, last question for you. So I was talking to a friend of mine. He knew I was going to be doing this episode, and he lives in Texas. The part of the country that he lives in, that he doesn't have any hummingbirds. They can't get any. And so the question is if you want to attract hummingbirds to your property, obviously they're in Texas. So what would you recommend? Just planting flowers that are red and orange, or what would you do?
Yeah. Where does he live, by the
way? He lives in an area called Brenham, Texas, which is in between Austin and Houston.
Well, there are birds there.
I'm sure there is. I think they live like.
Haven't seen any yet.
Yeah. Well, he had a feeder out and they didn't get any, And I said, well, I was going to talk to you and say, okay, what would you recommend him do? And my thought was just plant some flowers. You got some plants that have red flowers on.
Yeah. And there's a list of flowers on my website.
Okay, I'll bring him to that.
That I've tried personally and I know to work. I don't still have them all growing right now in my yard. Well, not now.
Oh yeah, well you guys are freezing out there. You're in St. Louis.
Yeah, it was like 9 here last night.
I talked to my mom last night, who lives in St. Louis too, and she's outside of St. Louis. She said it was really cold there.
Yeah, and icy.
Yeah. That's a rainy ice.
We haven't seen a snow pile yet in our street.
So, hey, Lanny, we're at the end, and I want to get to the joke, but can you, for everybody that's listening, and I'm going to, for you guys listening, it's in the description as well, your website address, so people and all the other questions they may have or be able to send you a message or something. Can you give that out right now?
My website's URL is hummingbirds.net.
Okay. And that's the best way to get hold of you. Are you on social media at all?
No.
Okay. So hummingbirds.net for everybody's listening.
And I don't encourage emailing.
Okay. So if you got questions, well, here, for my audience, if you've got questions, you can email me. That's a good way to get a hold of me. And that's it. Well, we'll get to that. We're at our joke. So I've got a hummingbird joke for you. For everybody listening, I know you're cringing now. So let me preface this by saying I would love to have your kids, your nieces, nephews, grandkids, if they want to tell a joke, you're more than welcome to come on the show and send me an email at mkyle@forrealpodcast.com. And I promise you, your joke will always be better than mine. But for you, Lanny, I've got one for you. Ready?
Yep.
Okay, what do you get when you cross a hummingbird and a doorbell?
Oh, my. Okay, I give up.
Humdinger. Anyways, like I said, they're bad.
Gotcha.
Anyways, again, everybody that's listening, please keep following, spread the word. I love have episodes like this and have Lanny on. If you got somebody that you want to have on, that would be great. Again, mkyle@forrealpodcast.com. You go to the website, whatever you want to do. And I will get back to you. And I love suggestions, and I do follow up with everyone. But first off,
on my website, I encourage you, if you have a question, to go to hummingbirds.net. There's a big flashing panel on the homepage that'll take you right to the frequently asked questions page. And that was developed from all the emails that people used to send me that I used to get like 400 or 500 a day, and I just had no time to answer all those. So that was back when I still had a life before I retired.
yeah.
So I made a fact page, and there are other areas on my website that have more detail about some areas like migration.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great website.
So take a look on the website first.
Yeah.
And if you still can't find what you want, pester Mark about it.
Yeah, please do. But by the way, I've been on the website and there's all kinds of information. There's a plethora of information. There's a wealth of stuff on there that, if you like any of this, and we didn't get into everything. There's other stuff we could have got into too, but I didn't want to be on too long and keep you.
Spend a week there easily.
Oh, easily. But hey, Lanny, first off, seriously, thanks so much for taking the time to be on here. I really, really appreciate it.
You're certainly welcome, Mark.
I'm just, as you can tell, just fascinated. I did spend a lot of time looking at it, and I'll be looking at more because there's just so many different things. And I love the idea of the oil derricks out there and the shrimp boats. I think that's really cool. I didn't know that. I love that. Puts a smile on my face, to be honest with you. And by the way, and for everybody else out there, as I always say, thank you so very much for following. It means a lot to me. And please spread the word. The more people that find out about it, the more opportunities I have great guests like Lanny on. But really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for listening. For real.
That concludes this episode of For Real with your host, Mark Kyle. For previous and future episodes of For Real, listen via all major podcast streaming sites.
You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/kidsandfamily. Just go to Indeed.com/kidsandfamily right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.